Chapter 1: The Pallet and the River. The story begins not with a pyramid, but with a dark stone object called the Nama pallet. It was carved more than 5,000 years ago, in the shape of a shield, and covered with small, crowded scenes. A ruler strikes an enemy. Standards are raised, animals twist together. Divine symbols watch over the action. This object seems to announce a united Egypt, but it also points to a deeper question. What kind of Nile world made such power possible? The Nama pallet makes a powerful claim. It shows a ruler striking an enemy, wearing crowns linked with Upper and Lower Egypt, and standing above ordered rows of defeated bodies. But it is not a documentary record of unification. It tells us how kingship wanted to be seen, forceful, sacred, and in control. To understand what stood behind that image, the story has to move back before kings, to the communities drawn toward the Nile as North Africa grew drier. To understand what stood behind early images of a unified Egypt, the starting point is not a king, but a map. Most life gathered in a long, narrow corridor beside the Nile. To the north, the river spread into the broad delta before reaching the Mediterranean. On both sides, deserts pressed close. They did not make settlement impossible everywhere, but they sharply concentrated farming, villages, travel, and power near one dependable river. A small wooden model boat from an Egyptian tomb shows how central the river was to daily life. The Nile was not only water for fields, it was Egypt's main road. Boats carried grain, stone, pottery, officials, soldiers, and news between settlements. Northward, the current helped movement toward the Mediterranean. Southward, sailors used the wind. But travel was not endless. In the far south, rocky cataracts broke the river and made passage difficult, marking zones of contact and separation. Each year, the Nile did more than carry people and goods. In summer, its waters rose and spread across the low floodplain. When the flood withdrew, it left damp ground and a thin layer of dark, fertile silt. In a land bordered by desert, this pattern mattered deeply. Farmers could plant near the river with a better chance of harvest because the soil had been renewed by water that returned again and again. Long before kings claimed a united Egypt, the land around the Nile was changing. Across North Africa, older grasslands and lakes were shrinking as the climate grew drier. People did not move into an empty world. They adjusted, following dependable water, grazing animals, fish, plants, and seasonal food. The Nile offered something rare, a river that kept flowing through desert. Its banks became gathering places, and over time those gatherings became lasting communities. Along the Nile, farming was only part of the reason people could stay. The river gave fish, water birds, and plants for food. Reeds became mats, baskets, roofs, and light boats. Mud from the banks could be shaped into bricks, plaster, and storage jars. Nearby patches of grass supported animals, while desert edges offered places to gather useful stone and fuel. Behind early symbols of a united Egypt stood these practical river communities, built from the Nile's full range of resources. Before pyramids, crowns, or famous kings, Egypt began with people learning how to live beside the Nile. The drying climate pushed them toward a narrow river valley, where floodwater, fertile silt, fish, reeds, stone, and boat travel made permanent communities possible. That was the deeper foundation behind later images of unity, not one object, but generations of adaptation. The next question is how these farming settlements became larger, richer, and more unequal regional societies. Chapter 2: Villages before the pharaohs. In the Fayum region, baskets, grain pits, and animal bones show a slow change in daily life. Families still fished, gathered plants, and used the river, but they also planted small grain fields and kept herds nearby. Because Nile water returned in a pattern they could learn, harvests became more dependable. Food could be stored, households stayed longer in one place, and village routines began to link work, property, and responsibility across generations. In small Nile villages, a good harvest did not end when grain was cut. It had to be dried, measured, carried, and stored in pits, baskets, and clay-lined bins. This changed food into something people could manage across the seasons. A household with fuller stores could survive a poor month, feed workers, lend grain, or refuse help. Dependable farming created surplus, and surplus created choices. It also created inequality, because stored food could be counted, protected, shared, or withheld. In Badarian graves, archaeologists found thin, polished pottery with blackened rims, beside beads, woven cloth, worked bone, and small decorated objects. These things were useful, but they also showed care, skill, and time. Stored food made that possible. Not everyone had to gather or farm every moment. Some people could shape clay, spin fibers, drill beads, or trade for stone and shells from elsewhere. Possessions began to mark difference before kings existed. A small red seashell found in an inland grave tells a larger story. Nile villages were no longer limited to what their own fields and marshes provided. Goods moved by boat, by desert paths, south toward Nubia, and northeast toward the Levant. Shells, hard stones, copper, pigments, and rare ornaments passed through many hands. Families with better access to these materials could display higher status, and some communities grew richer than others. In some pre-dynastic cemeteries, the difference between graves became hard to miss. Many burials stayed simple, with a few pots or personal items. Others held richer sets of pottery, beads, tools, animal products, and materials brought from far away. This did not yet mean a finished state existed, but it showed that exchange and surplus were no longer shared evenly. Status could now be displayed after death, remembered by the living, and turned into lasting claims of importance. A carved ceremonial mace head from late pre-dynastic Egypt shows a ruler figure above organized rows of people and goods. It points to a new kind of power. In growing villages, surplus grain could feed workers, craftspeople made prestige objects, and exchange linked one community to another. Some families used wealth, display, and ritual status to claim authority over labor and loyalty. But this was not one peaceful hierarchy. Upper Egyptian centers grew as rivals, each pressing for advantage. By the late pre-dynastic period, Upper Egypt was no longer a chain of equal villages. Centers such as Nakada, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos grew richer and more ambitious. Workshops made finer goods. Graves displayed status more clearly. Exchange routes brought valued materials and wider contacts. Surplus food supported specialists and leaders, while inequality became harder to ignore. These powers competed for people, roots, prestige, and control. That rivalry was not unification yet, but it made later consolidation possible. By the end of the pre-dynastic period, Egypt was not yet a single kingdom, but the foundations were already in place. Villages had learned to farm the Nile, store surplus grain, and support skilled craft workers. Exchange linked communities over long distances. Some burials became richer than others, showing growing inequality. Chiefs led powerful centers, and those centers competed. This rivalry was the last step before unity, making later political consolidation possible. Chapter 3: 2 Lands, 1 King. A decorated knife handle from Gebel el-Arak shows warriors, boats, and controlled violence, a small object from a time when power in Upper Egypt was still being contested. Rulers in towns such as Hierakonpolis, Nakada, and Abydos competed for people, fields, cattle, workshops, and river traffic. No single capital yet commanded the land. Strength came from organizing labor, moving goods by boat, rewarding followers, and turning local victories into wider prestige along the Nile corridor. A small carved label from Abydos shows boats, standards, and signs of royal control moving along the river. It points to a struggle that had grown beyond one town defeating another. Southern rulers needed the Nile itself, its routes, harbors, fields, and crossings. As their power reached northward, settlements near trade paths became strategic prizes. The delta was not just a wide marshy partner to the south. It was the doorway to exchange, and the next test of kingship. On a ceremonial pallet found at Hierakonpolis, the name of Narmer appears beside a king shown striking a defeated enemy. This was not just a record of one battle. It turned southern rivalry and northward expansion into a royal claim. One ruler had mastered both lands. The imagery is violent, but the message is orderly. Crowns, standards, and processions present conquest as legitimate rule. After Narmer, First Dynasty succession helped preserve that claim beyond a single reign. After Narmer, the claim of unity did not depend on one victory scene alone. It became the work of kings who followed him. Early First Dynasty rulers inherited the idea that one pharaoh could rule both Upper and Lower Egypt, shown through the paired crowns and repeated royal titles. Conquest was remembered, but kingship made it orderly. At Abydos, their tombs gave this new line a lasting place, where royal memory could be protected and renewed. On royal images from early Egypt, power could be read in a crown. The tall white crown marked the southern land, while the red crown, with its curled front, marked the northern delta. When artists showed one king wearing the combined crown, the message was immediate. Conquest had been turned into order. The ruler was not only a victor over enemies. He was presented as the legitimate lord of both lands, joined in one royal body. On ivory labels and stone vessels from Abydos, early royal names appear beside signs of authority. These objects show that unity was not only drawn as two crowns, it was spoken and written into kingship itself. Titles linked the ruler to Upper and Lower Egypt, making the union part of every official setting: a seal, a tomb, a ceremony, or a delivery record. At Abydos, the tombs of early kings gave that claim a lasting home, where later generations could remember the line. At Abydos, in the dry ground west of the Nile, archaeologists found the tombs of Egypt's first kings. These burials were more than graves. They tied the new royal line to a sacred southern landscape, where the dead king could be remembered as part of an unbroken dynasty. Each tomb made succession visible after death. While Memphis would matter for controlling movement between valley and delta, Abydos gave early kingship its deeper claim to legitimacy. Abydos gave early kings a deep claim to memory and legitimacy in the south. But a united Egypt could not be held by tombs and symbols alone. It needed a place where orders, goods, officials, and soldiers could move between the long Nile Valley and the broad delta. Memphis stood near that meeting point. From there, the king's government could watch the routes north and south. One kingship now claimed both lands. The next challenge was making that claim work every day. Chapter 4. Making the state work. On small tags from early royal tombs, simple signs name kings, places, and goods. They show a new problem after unification. The king could not stand beside every jar of oil, basket of grain, or piece of tomb equipment. Authority had to travel without him. Marks on containers, seals, and official objects made goods readable. They could identify who owned them, where they came from, where they were going, and which royal household or official controlled them. A clay ceiling from an early royal storehouse could carry the mark of an official, the place it came from, and the authority that received it. Tags and labels did the same work for jars, baskets, and bundles. They made goods traceable after they left the hands that packed them. Year names added another layer. A delivery, ceremony, or inspection could be tied to a named year of the king's reign, turning scattered actions into a remembered sequence. A clay ceiling from an early royal storehouse gives a practical clue. It shows that goods were not simply taken in the king's name and forgotten. They passed through a household that was also a government. Around the king stood officials, scribes, overseers, and estate managers. They read marks, checked deliveries, assigned supplies, and supervised workers. The palace became the place where royal authority turned into daily decisions about grain, cattle, land, labor, and service. At Memphis, near the meeting point of Upper and Lower Egypt, royal power gained a working address. From this center, officials could watch movement along the Nile and send orders north and south. Estates tied to the king, temples, and high offices managed fields, herds, workshops, and storehouses. Local districts supplied grain, livestock, labor, cloth, tools, and other goods. In return, the center recorded, stored, and redistributed what it collected, turning rule into a repeated system. On early jar labels and seal impressions, small signs record goods tied to names, places, and royal officials. These marks point to a practical system. Districts owed grain from fields, animals from herds, labor from households, and finished goods from workshops. Scribes assessed what existed, officials collected it, and sealed containers carried it into royal or temple stores. There, local output became state resources, ready to feed workers, support officers, supply rituals, and fund the king's projects. Stored wealth mattered because it could be used again. Grain, cattle products, cloth, tools, and finished goods moved from farms and workshops into controlled storehouses. Officials recorded amounts, checked deliveries, and sent supplies back out. Rations fed workers. Goods supported scribes, guards, priests, and craftsmen. Ceremonies received offerings. Royal projects received food, materials, and labor. With calendars, measures, and regular counts, the king's claim became a working system that could organize people over time. A small label on a jar or basket could carry more than a name. It could mark a quantity, a place, and a moment in the year. Early Egypt's rulers needed this kind of regularity. Grain came in after the flood. Herds were counted. Storehouses recorded what arrived and what left. Work crews could be gathered because officials knew when, where, and how much was required. Measurement made rule repeatable, and ceremony gave that order sacred weight. A carved festival scene shows the king running before the gods, proving that rule was not only paperwork. Measures, records, officials, storehouses, and provincial overseers made the kingdom work day by day. Ceremonies gave that work sacred meaning. They displayed full granaries, orderly labor, and the king's duty to uphold ma'at, the right balance of the world. Together, practical control and ritual authority made kingship last beyond conquest, ready to organize projects far larger than one ruler's lifetime. Chapter 5. Djoser and the First Stone Pyramid. At Saqqara, Djoser's step pyramid began with more than a king's wish. It rose from a government already able to count grain, collect taxes, store supplies, and call workers from the provinces. Scribes kept records. Officials moved food, tools, and stone. Court specialists, represented by Imhotep, shaped command into design. The monument joined ritual kingship with organized labor and skilled construction, creating the working model for Egypt's pyramid age. At Saqqara, Djoser's name is linked with a remarkable official, Imhotep. Later Egyptians remembered him as a wise man, but here he matters as a working figure of the royal court. He stood for the scribes, planners, priests, and overseers who could turn royal authority into organized labor. Under that system, stone was quarried, hauled, counted, shaped, and set in place for a sacred purpose, to make the king's burial serve the order of Egypt itself. The step pyramid did not begin as a shape no one had seen before. It began with the mastaba, the low rectangular tomb already used by Egypt's elite. Under Djoser's court, that familiar form was enlarged, then enlarged again, until one stone platform rose above another. Older burial ideas remained, but limestone gave them new permanence. Administration, royal ritual, skilled design, and organized labor had turned a known tomb into the beginning of the Pyramid Age. Around Djoser's step pyramid, the builders did not leave empty ground. They shaped a whole royal precinct, enclosed by a high limestone wall, and entered through controlled passages. Inside were broad courts, chapels, and solid dummy buildings that copied older forms once made from reeds, wood, and mud brick. Now those familiar shapes were remade in stone. This setting allowed the king's power to be renewed through ritual, with administration, belief, design, and labor working as one system. At Saqqara, the stone still copies an older world. Doorways, reed mats, wooden beams, and mud brick walls were reimagined as cut limestone, shaped to look familiar but made to last. This was not only a bigger tomb, it was a new kind of royal project. Quarrymen cut blocks, haulers moved them, Masons fitted them, and officials organized the work. Belief, design, labor, and administration met in stone, opening the age of the pyramids. A limestone block from Djoser's complex shows the practical change taking place. Building in stone meant sending crews to quarry the rock, cut it free, and drag it toward the worksite. Other workers shaped the blocks into useful sizes, checked their faces, and lifted them into position again and again. This was disciplined labor, directed by officials and skilled builders. Yet the effort served more than engineering. The stone complex made royal power permanent and kept the king's sacred role active after death. Saqqara was not only a tomb. Its courts, chapels, and passages gave Djoser a place to remain king after death. Ritual spaces could renew his power, affirm his authority, and keep his presence active among the living gods and the living people. The pyramid complex joined many forces into one model. Officials who organized resources, sacred ideas about kingship, skilled court designers, and builders who made stone serve a permanent royal purpose. At Saqqara, Djoser's monument brought several forces together in one place. Officials organized supplies, workers, and records. Priests framed the king's burial as a sacred act tied to renewal. Skilled designers turned older tomb forms into a new stone structure. Quarrymen, haulers, and builders proved that royal power could be made permanent in limestone. This was more than a tomb. It was a working model for the Pyramid Age, ready for later kings to expand on a far greater scale. Chapter 6: Giza and the Pyramid Machine. At Dashur, the bent pyramid still shows the moment Egyptian builders changed their plan while the work was underway. Sneferu's reign became a testing ground on a huge scale. At Midam, one design was pushed too far and later failed. At Dashur, the angle was corrected before completion. Then the Red Pyramid showed a more stable solution. These projects taught officials, quarry teams, haulers, and architects how to organize the greater pyramid works that followed. At Giza, Khufu took the lessons learned at Dashur and pushed them further. His pyramid was not a sudden miracle, but the result of skilled surveyors, experienced builders, and officials who could organize work year after year. The base was set out with remarkable precision. Stone had to be quarried, shaped, moved at the right season, and placed in steady order. Its size showed more than ambition. It showed a state able to command materials, labor, food, and planning on an enormous scale. Khufu's pyramid did not stand alone for long. His successors turned the Giza Plateau into a connected royal landscape. Khafre built his own pyramid nearby, with temples linked by a long causeway down toward the valley and the river approach. Menkaure added a smaller pyramid and its own temple complex. Beside these monuments, the Great Sphinx joined royal power to sacred image facing the eastern horizon. Giza became more than a tomb. It was a planned dynastic zone. The pyramid was not built by a faceless crowd of slaves. At Giza, evidence points to rotating crews organized by the state. Some quarried stone, some hauled blocks, some shaped surfaces, and others kept tools, ramps, and work areas in order. Work gangs even left names in hidden places, like team marks on the monument itself. Nearby settlements held supervisors, bakers, brewers, craft workers, and laborers, showing a planned system of skill, rotation, and command. A pyramid work site also needed food on a massive scale. Bakeries turned grain into bread, and breweries made beer, a daily ration as important as water. Herds supplied cattle, goats, and sheep, while fish and vegetables added variety. Grain had to be stored, counted, and released on schedule. Scribes tracked deliveries and rations, linking the workers at Giza to estates, taxes, provincial officials, and boats moving supplies along the Nile. A limestone block began in a quarry, cut from the bedrock with copper tools, stone pounders, and wooden levers. Workers dragged it on a sledge, often over wetted ground to reduce friction. Some stone came by boat using Nile channels, harbor basins, and canals near the plateau. From there, teams hauled blocks along causeways and work roads. Ramps carried them upward as the pyramid rose. Rose quote, "No single trick explains it. The system worked because each stage joined the next." At Giza, every ration had a longer story behind it. Grain came from royal estates and provincial fields. Cattle, beer, cloth, timber, rope, and tools moved through systems of tax and obligation. Scribes recorded what was owed, what arrived, and who received it. Boats carried supplies along the Nile, turning distant harvests into meals and wages. The pyramid was built from stone, but also from accounting, transport, seasonal labor, expert direction, and royal power. Giza was not built by stone moving alone. Each block depended on another movement, less visible but just as important: grain collected as tax, rations issued to workers, crews organized by officials, boats scheduled on the river, and skilled hands assigned where knowledge mattered most. Royal authority gave the command, but the Old Kingdom state made it practical. Behind the pyramids stood fields, households, workshops, storehouses, scribes, and communities tied into one vast system of obligation and support. Chapter 7: Life in the Old Kingdom. When a season of pyramid work ended, most workers did not remain beside the monument. They returned to fields along the Nile, to small towns, temple estates, and villages of mud brick houses. Their lives were measured by planting, harvests, animals, family duties, and local officials. Royal building depended on this wider world. Households produced food, labor, cloth, and taxes, and the state drew on those resources when it needed people for great projects. A painted tomb scene from the Old Kingdom shows a society arranged by rank and duty. At the top stood the king, whose authority connected land, gods, and labor. Beneath him were high officials and estate managers who counted grain, assigned work, and reported results. Priests served temples and royal mortuary cults. Scribes made government possible through writing. Skilled artisans shaped stone, wood, and metal, while farmers, servants, and dependent laborers carried heavier burdens with far less freedom. Most Egyptians lived in mud brick houses built close together, with small rooms that stayed cooler than the street outside. Roofs were useful spaces for sleeping, drying food, or storing tools. Inside were simple stools, low beds, reed mats, baskets, storage jars, and grinding stones for making flour. Work often continued in shaded courtyards or alleys. Elite homes were larger, with more rooms, finer furniture, and greater supplies, making rank visible in daily life. A painted baking and brewing scene from an Old Kingdom tomb shows the daily work behind survival. Grain became bread, and bread went with beer, thick and nourishing for most meals. Families added onions, lentils, beans, fish, and sometimes meat, milk, or cheese. Linen kept bodies cooler in the heat. Many men shaved, and people washed with water and natron, rubbed on oils, used cosmetics, and fought dust, insects, and sore muscles from hard labor. A simple household scene from an Egyptian tomb can show people grinding grain, preparing food, watching children, and managing stores. Marriage was usually a family arrangement, not a ceremony run by the state. It joined labor, property, and kin. A household might include a husband and wife, children, relatives, servants, or dependents. Each person helped survival in practical ways: baking, brewing, weaving, farming, caring for animals, guarding supplies, and keeping the home's property in order. A useful witness is an elite tomb scene showing women beside goods, servants, and estate records. It points to a real part of Egyptian household life. Women could own property, receive goods, pass wealth to children, and appear in documents as economic actors. This did not mean equal power in every home. Status, marriage, age, and family backing mattered. A wealthy widow had more room to act than a young dependent woman in a poor household. On tomb walls, rows of farmers cut grain, beat it from the stalks, and carry sacks to storehouses. These scenes show the yearly rhythm behind Egypt's wealth. When the Nile flood withdrew, fields were prepared, seed was sown, and the harvest was counted, threshed, stored, and delivered. Beside the fields, Workshops turned labor into goods, potters shaped jars, carpenters made tools, weavers produced cloth, and metal workers and stone workers supplied estates, villages, temples, and royal projects. A village household could grow grain, bake bread, brew beer, mend tools, and trade small goods with neighbors. But it was never fully separate from the state. Officials counted fields, measured harvests, collected taxes, and assigned labor service to estates or royal projects. Scribes turned work into records, and records into obligation. A well-connected official might benefit from this system. A poor tenant or dependent worker felt its weight more sharply. Old Kingdom Egypt was therefore unequal, but tightly linked from household to palace. Chapter 8. Gods, Tombs, and the Afterlife. On the walls of Old Kingdom tomb chapels, offering scenes show food, workers, scribes, and family arranged in careful order. They reveal a central Egyptian belief: the world survived when balance was maintained. Right conduct, honest dealing, family duty, labor, taxes, and ritual all belonged to this order. At its highest point stood the king. He was not only a ruler, but the human office responsible for upholding divine order before the gods. On temple walls, the king appears offering food, incense, and flowers to the gods. These scenes were not only decoration. They showed his official duty to uphold sacred order for all Egypt. As the god's chief earthly partner, he could command labor, build temples, and supply priests with offerings. Ordinary people prayed at local shrines and honored household gods, but royal ritual worked on a national scale, tying palace power to divine stability. Beyond the king's temples, Egyptian religion also lived in towns, villages, and regional centers. Each place had gods who belonged closely to its people. A local shrine might receive bread, beer, incense, flowers, or small objects given in thanks or hope. Priests cared for the god's image, kept rituals on schedule, and organized festivals that drew whole communities together. Sacred order was therefore not only royal, it was a shared pattern of service, obligation, and trust. On many tomb walls, a small painted scene shows the dead person seated before bread, beer, meat, and jars. This was not decoration alone. Egyptians believed a person continued in several parts. The ka needed nourishment, sustained by offerings and prayers. The ba could move, but it needed a known place and a recognizable body to return to. For this reason, the corpse mattered. Identity was not discarded at death. It had to be protected, supplied, and remembered. In many Egyptian tombs, the most important space was not hidden underground, but open to visitors. A chapel allowed relatives to return with bread, beer, flowers, and prayers. A false door marked the place where the living and the dead could meet. Goods placed in the tomb supplied comfort and status, but regular offerings kept the relationship active. As in the temples, care had to be repeated, and it tied the dead person back to family, property, and community. A linen-wrapped body from an Old Kingdom cemetery shows how uneven burial care could be. Egyptians believed the body mattered because the ka and ba needed a lasting home, but preservation was not the same for everyone. Wealthy families could pay for careful wrapping, better coffins, resins, and protected tombs. Kings had far more, including sacred pyramid texts carved for royal rebirth. Many ordinary people received simpler burials, shaped by household means, local skill, and the dry desert ground. Inside the royal pyramids, the walls could speak for the dead king. The pyramid texts were carved spells, ritual phrases, and powerful claims meant to lift him from death into divine life. They named gods, opened paths through the sky, and presented the king as someone transformed, not simply buried. This was not a resource for every Egyptian. Elite tombs displayed status and offerings, while simpler graves held modest hopes. Royal death received the most privileged language of eternity. In elite mastaba tombs, carved and painted scenes showed estates at work. Farmers cut grain, herdsmen drove cattle, brewers made beer, and servants carried food toward the owner's table. These images were not just decoration. They claimed status, labor, and abundance for the next life. But most Egyptians were buried more simply, with fewer goods and little display. Hope for survival after death reached across society, yet the materials of that hope were unequal. Sacred order therefore supported both belief and hierarchy. Chapter 9. When the Old Kingdom broke apart. In provincial tombs, governors began to present themselves with a confidence once reserved for the court. Their offices passed through families, and their wealth came from fields, workshops, temples, and labor gangs in their own districts. When the palace weakened, administration did not disappear. Taxes were still gathered, canals still maintained, and local obligations still enforced. But power now had regional roots, and Egypt began to split between rival centers, especially Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes in the south. At places like Beni Hassan, the rock-cut tombs of provincial governors show a clear shift in power. Their inscriptions do not speak only as servants of a distant king. They present these men as protectors of towns, organizers of food, patrons of temples, and employers of local workers. Egypt's central authority was weakening, but its habits of administration did not disappear. Taxes, labor duties, and local justice continued, now tied more closely to powerful families in the provinces. A small seated statue of Pepi II shows a child king under the protection of his mother. It points to the problem that came later. Pepi ruled for an unusually long time, perhaps for most of a human lifetime. During those decades, heirs grew old, court factions hardened, and senior officials built careers that no longer depended fully on a strong king. When power finally had to pass on, succession was not just a palace question. The crown had fewer resources with which to command loyalty. A provincial tax account from this age shows grain, workers, and duties being counted close to home. That detail matters. Kings still claimed authority, but more wealth was tied up in temple endowments, private estates, exemptions, and local offices. The crown had less dependable income to move officials, feed work crews, maintain monuments, or reward loyal servants. Weak succession therefore became more than a palace problem. When the throne changed hands, there were fewer resources to make distant provinces obey. At Elephantine, governors later claimed they opened storehouses and fed people when hunger struck. Such inscriptions cannot be read as a weather report, but they fit other clues that some Nile floods were weak. A low inundation meant less silt, smaller harvests, higher grain prices, and movement by families looking for food. Still, climate was not the whole answer. Poor floods added pressure to a kingdom already strained by money, succession, and provincial power. In several provincial tomb inscriptions, officials present themselves as protectors in hard years. They say they fed the hungry, helped strangers who had moved in search of food, and kept their districts alive when scarcity pressed on families. These claims were meant to praise the official, so they cannot be read as simple reports. But they still reveal local memory of hunger, migration, and relief. Even as royal control weakened, communities expected leaders to organize aid and defend order close to home. A stela naming a local ruler as king shows how far the old order had changed. During the first intermediate period, Egypt no longer answered to one uncontested court. In the north, rulers at Heracleopolis claimed royal authority and tried to hold the Nile Valley together. In the south, Thebes built its own power, loyalty, and armies. This was political fracture, not disappearance. Local officials still collected grain, temples still worked, and communities still depended on familiar obligations. A provincial tomb inscription from this troubled age shows the point clearly. A local governor still boasted of feeding his town, managing fields, and keeping order. Egypt was divided, but it had not simply stopped working. Temples received offerings. Estates counted grain and labor. Families still owed taxes, service, and loyalty to nearby leaders. The old unity failed because succession, royal wealth, flood stress, hardship, and provincial power weakened together. not because Egyptian institutions disappeared. Chapter 10. Thebes reunites Egypt. A limestone relief from Thebes shows how a local court could look royal before it ruled all Egypt. By this time, Thebes was no longer only a survivor of disorder. Its rulers controlled routes through Upper Egypt, drew strength from nearby towns, and supported temples that gave their power a sacred face. Local soldiers and loyal officials turned a regional base into something larger, an organized challenge to the rival kings who still held the north. A seal impression from this age can name a king, but not all was a king accepted by all Egypt. In the south, Theban rulers built power around their own city and temples. In the north, rival rulers also claimed the throne. Fields were still planted, taxes still collected, and local officials still settled disputes. But the country was not truly united. Thebes did not just need to restore order. It had to defeat another kingship. A painted scene from Mentuhotep II's mortuary complex at Thebes shows soldiers in ordered ranks, a reminder that reunification was not only a claim, it had to be won. From Thebes, Mentuhotep pressed north in a series of campaigns against rival rulers who still held power in Lower Egypt. Around 2055 BCE, their resistance broke. The two lands were again ruled by one king, and tribute, orders, and recognition could flow back to a single royal court. After the fighting ended, Mentuhotep II still had to make victory look like rightful rule. Inscriptions, royal names, and monuments helped turn conquest into restoration. They presented him as the king who healed Egypt after years of division, not merely as a Theban ruler who had defeated his rivals. Public memory mattered. Officials, priests, soldiers, and farming communities had to recognize one throne again, and royal commemoration taught them how to understand the change. On stone monuments from Thebes, Amun began to appear as more than a local god. For the restored monarchy, this mattered. The kings who had reunited Egypt came from Thebes, and their authority needed roots deeper than victory in war. By honoring Amun in royal language, the court connected kingship to a divine patron close to home. This was not yet the great imperial theology of later centuries. It was a practical sacred vocabulary for a reunited kingdom. At Deir el-Bahri, beside the cliffs of western Thebes, Mentuhotep II built his mortuary complex into the sacred landscape. It was more than a tomb. It made reunification visible. The king's afterlife cult stood where priests, officials, and visitors could connect his memory with restored order after civil division. In stone, ritual, and setting, the new Theban regime claimed that Egypt had been joined again under a rightful ruler. Reunification could be carved into stone, but it still had to survive ordinary politics. A victorious Theban king could defeat rivals and claim Egypt as one land again. Yet the harder task came after victory. Officials had to obey the palace, local governors had to accept limits, and the throne needed a future beyond one strong ruler. The end of the 11th dynasty therefore became a test of durability, whether restored unity could become a rebuilt state. A seal impression naming Ichitowi points to a deliberate new beginning. Under the 12th dynasty, Egypt's kings shifted the royal center northward, closer to the meeting place of Upper and Lower Egypt. This was more than a change of residence. The court no longer ruled only from the victorious southern homeland. It stood nearer the whole country, where messages, officials, and decisions could move more evenly through a reunited land. Unity now needed careful government. Chapter 11. Governing the Middle Kingdom. A court seal from the Middle Kingdom shows a different kind of power from a battlefield scene. After reunification, Egypt's rulers had to make unity ordinary. The king could not hold the country together by marching forever. Decisions needed a permanent court, officials who knew their duties, and clear chains of command from palace to province. Officers outlived individual moments of victory, so orders, records, appointments, and judgments could keep moving when the army was no longer the main tool of control. On some Middle Kingdom monuments, a younger royal figure appears beside the reigning king, not as a rival, but as an heir already learning power. This was practical politics. If a ruler died suddenly, the tax offices, granaries, work crews, courts, and scribal records could not wait for confusion at the palace. By associating a successor with rule, kings tried to make transition orderly, so commands kept moving from the court into daily administration. A Middle Kingdom papyrus account, with its neat columns and repeated headings, shows government becoming a working system. At the center stood the vizier, who received royal orders and turned them into instructions officials could follow. Treasuries tracked grain, metal, cattle, and labor. Seal-bearers controlled access to stored goods and authorized movement. Scribes copied commands, filed reports, and preserved accounts, so decisions survived beyond one reign and reached provincial offices in usable form. In the provinces, government still depended on people who knew the land. Local governors, scribes, and village officials understood which fields flooded well, which households owed labor, and where disputes might begin. But their authority now ran through the crown. Appointments came under closer royal control. Reports moved upward. Inspectors checked accounts and conduct. Grain, workers, cattle, and information had to be supplied when ordered. Local knowledge remained useful, but it served a more watchful central state. A field register from Middle Kingdom Egypt shows how power became paperwork. After the Nile flood withdrew, surveyors measured the cultivated land again, because boundaries could shift under silt and water. Scribes recorded fields, households, harvests, and available workers. These lists were not just notes. They turned land and people into expected dues, grain for storehouses, labor for canals, and service for royal projects. Provincial officials now governed by reporting what could be counted, taxed, collected, and assigned. A storehouse account could turn a harvest into government power. Grain paid as tax was measured, sealed, and entered in records. From there it could feed officials, temple staff, soldiers, and workers on state jobs. Some households also owed service, not just produce. Men could be assigned to dig canals, repair dikes, move stone, or work royal land. In this way, assessment became bread, wages, labor, and authority that people met in daily life. Nilometers, cut into stone beside the river, turned the flood into information. Officials watched the height of the Nile, recorded it, and planned from it. Basins and canals had to be cleared, banks repaired, and labor assigned before the water arrived. In the pharaohs, rulers invested in channels that brought more land under cultivation. Better water control meant fewer surprises, more grain in storage, and a steadier tax base for the restored state. A written petition could turn a private grievance into a public case. People brought contracts, named witnesses, and asked officials to judge disputes over land, wages, loans, theft, injury, or inheritance. Records did more than count grain and labor. They made duties provable. Courts gave formal decisions, and punishments could be severe. Yet fairness was never separate from power. Status, access to scribes, local officials, and royal authority shaped what justice could actually deliver. Chapter 12. Fortresses, Mines, and Trade Routes. A Middle Kingdom granary model shows workers measuring sacks, scribes recording totals, and officials turning harvest into state power. That system did more than feed towns and temples. It let the king send people outward. Grain could supply soldiers. Labor could build forts. Copper, stone, timber, and tools could be moved where the crown needed them. In Lower Nubia, Egypt's organized revenue became action beyond the core Nile Valley, linking prosperity to defended frontiers, military labor, resource extraction, and exchange. A boundary stealer from Egypt's southern frontier shows how the Middle Kingdom looked beyond its old border. Lower Nubia was not just distant desert and riverbank, it was the Nile road south, where boats, soldiers, traders, and messengers had to pass through narrow stretches of water and stone. By pushing control into this corridor, Egyptian rulers could watch movement, restrict traffic, and protect the routes that led toward Nubian gold and other wealth. At Semna and the nearby forts of the Second Cataract, Stone and mud brick turned the Nile itself into a controlled border. Walls, towers, narrow gates, and lookout points watched the river bends where boats had to slow. Soldiers checked movement, patrols guarded tracks, and archers made passage dangerous without permission. Scribes recorded people, goods, rations, and orders. The system protected Nubian gold routes and secured transport, showing that Middle Kingdom prosperity depended on defended frontiers, labor, extraction, and exchange. Inside the southern forts, power depended on daily work. Soldiers stood watch on walls, patrolled roads and riverbanks, escorted boats, and kept bows, spears, and shields ready. They practiced archery because a frontier was only useful if it could be defended. Behind them were cooks, storekeepers, and scribes counting grain, beer, linen, and deliveries. This system protected transport from Nubia, especially gold, and showed how Middle Kingdom prosperity relied on guarded borders, military labor, resources, and exchange. A Middle Kingdom gold necklace helps explain why Egypt looked south with such care. Nubia was not only a borderland of forts and soldiers. It was a route toward gold-bearing regions, labor, cattle, and goods moving along the Nile. To profit from this wealth, Egypt had to protect boats, control landing places, and keep workers and supplies moving. Prosperity at home depended on defended frontiers, organized labor, resource extraction, and exchange. Desert and Sinai expeditions for stone, copper, and turquoise needed different planning and protection. Beyond Nubia, Middle Kingdom wealth also came from harder routes away from the river. Officials led workers, quarrymen, miners, and soldiers into the eastern deserts and Sinai for stone, copper, and turquoise. These journeys needed waterskins, wells, pack animals, guards, and careful records. Inscriptions left on desert rocks named leaders and kings, turning dangerous labor into royal achievement. Prosperity now depended on defended frontiers, military labor, resource extraction, and widening exchange beyond Egypt. A painted box from Middle Kingdom Egypt shows boats moving with order and purpose, a reminder that wealth did not come only from fields beside the Nile. Expeditions reached toward Red Sea routes and the land Egyptians called Punt, bringing incense, oils, animal skins, and rare materials. To the northeast, contacts with the Levant supplied timber Egypt lacked. This prosperity depended on guarded frontiers, soldiers, mining labor, and exchange networks working together. By the end of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt's wealth was not just a story of full fields and careful records. It also depended on the world beyond the villages. River crossings had to be guarded. Soldiers had to be supplied. Expeditions moved through deserts to reach mines and quarries. Gold, stone, copper, and rare goods came through controlled routes. Trade with Kerma, Levantine partners, Red Sea intermediaries, and desert communities worked alongside military security and organized labor. Chapter 13. Voices of the Middle Kingdom. On a Middle Kingdom writing board, a student copied signs again and again, practicing the steady hand of a future scribe. Training meant word lists, model phrases, accounts, letters, and formal titles. This discipline opened a path into offices where grain, labor, taxes, and royal orders were recorded. Writing carried prestige and moral weight, because scribes shaped how prosperity described itself. But these voices were selective. They belonged mostly to a small trained minority, not to every Egyptian. On a school writing board or a copied teaching text, a student met more than spelling. He met a code for life. Instructional compositions praised the quiet, disciplined official, obedient to superiors, careful with speech, restrained in anger, loyal in service, and patient in ambition. Eloquence mattered, but only when it supported order. These were selective elite voices, yet they reveal how a refined Middle Kingdom society wanted success to sound, earned through training, self-control, and useful work. In the tale of the eloquent peasant, a poor man robbed on the road does not answer violence with violence. He speaks. Again and again he petitions an official, using careful language to demand justice. Other Middle Kingdom stories sent characters into exile, danger, magical marvels, or the royal court. These tales tested loyalty, fear, cleverness, and suffering, but they usually brought disorder back under control. Fiction allowed Egyptians to imagine crisis while still trusting balance. A practice letter on a writing board could carry more tension than a royal inscription. In these exercises, and in real letters like them, people asked for supplies, reported assignments, complained about delays, and reminded others of duties owed. A scribe learned not only words, but hierarchy. He wrote to superiors with care, to dependents with command, and to family with obligation. These voices are selective but vivid. They show a polished kingdom built on pressure, supervision, and need. A small wooden funerary model, showing servants grinding grain and baking bread, gives a careful clue to Middle Kingdom worries. It was made for the dead, but it speaks about the living. People knew the body could fail, work could become impossible, and age could leave a person dependent on others. Letters and tomb goods show concern for reputation, family support, and proper burial. These voices are selective, mostly from people with means, yet they reveal a refined society shadowed by insecurity. On Middle Kingdom coffins, painted columns of spells carried older royal hopes into more private tombs. These coffin texts promised names, breath, food, movement, and protection in the world beyond death. They show a wider circle reaching for sacred knowledge once tied to pyramids and kings. But this was not equality. A decorated coffin, trained scribes, offerings, and a proper burial still required wealth, status, and local support. The written voices are revealing, but selective. At Abydos, carved stelae and small memorial chapels show how religion moved into public memory. People who could not be buried beside Osiris still tried to place their names near his sacred landscape. Families visited, made offerings, and asked to share in renewal after death. Shabtis carried identity and service into that hoped-for future. These voices are selective, mostly from those with means, but they reveal a refined society whose wider hopes grew as royal authority weakened. The written voices of the Middle Kingdom reveal a society with confidence and skill, but only in fragments. They speak most clearly for officials, scribes, priests, and rulers, not for every farmer or worker along the Nile. By the later Middle Kingdom, that refined world was under strain. Reigns grew shorter, succession became less secure, and central power weakened. Egypt's culture reached widely, and its religion deepened, yet the kingdom was becoming easier to divide and challenge. Chapter 14. The Hyksos and the Divided Land. A scarab seal from the Eastern Delta carries a ruler's name in Egyptian style, but the world behind it was mixed. For generations, Levantine-speaking families had lived among Egyptian towns, farms, and workshops. They came through trade, migration, and service, not one sudden storm of invasion. As central power weakened, local leaders in the Delta gained room to act. From these long-settled communities, foreign-led authority began to form, rooted in Egypt's own divided landscape. At Avaris, the Eastern Delta's mixed communities became the base of Hyksos power. Their kings ruled from a court placed close to Egypt's fields, river branches, desert roads, and sea routes. This gave the Northern Kingdom real strength. Ships and caravans linked Avaris with the Levant and the wider Mediterranean. Goods, weapons, animals, and people moved through its markets. Hyksos rulers used Egyptian royal titles and administration, while keeping Western Asian connections that helped them govern and trade. At Avaris, seals and scarabs show Hyksos kings using Egyptian royal titles and the written habits of Egyptian government. They ruled through scribes, taxes, monuments, and religious claims that local people understood. But their court also kept strong Western Asian connections, seen in names, weapons, trade, and family networks across the Eastern Delta. Hyksos rule was foreign-led, yet it did not stand outside Egyptian culture. It blended power, identity, and practical administration. A Theban boundary stela helps reveal the problem facing southern Egypt. Thebes still ruled much of the south, but it was not master of the whole Nile Valley. Hyksos kings held power in the north, while Kush remained strong beyond Egypt's southern frontier. Theban rulers had to watch both directions. Rival courts could trade, threaten, or make agreements around them. In this divided world, war became harder, with new weapons and methods spreading gradually through contact, pressure, and necessity. A painted chariot wheel from later Egyptian tomb art points back to changes that began in this divided age. Horses, chariots, composite bows, stronger axes, and siege methods all became more important. The Hyksos were closely associated with these tools, but warfare did not change in one sudden moment. Skills moved through trade, migration, service, and battle. For Thebes, the lesson was practical. Old defenses were no longer enough against faster armies and harder fortresses. The damaged mummy of Seqenenre gives this turning point a human face. His skull shows terrible wounds made by weapons linked to the age of Hyksos power. Whether he died in battle or after capture, later memory tied him to resistance from Thebes. Under him, division was no longer just a political arrangement. It became a dynastic struggle. The old tension between Thebes and Avaris was hardening into open war. The evidence for Kamos's campaign survives on victory stelae from Thebes. In them, he speaks as a king angered by a divided Egypt, with Hyksos power in the north and Nubian pressure to the south. Kamosi attacked Hyksos positions and claimed success against their allies and messengers. His war did more than answer a family wound. It turned Theban resistance into a royal mission. Egypt should be ruled as one land again. Ahmose took up the war that Kamose had left unfinished. The Theban army pressed north, captured Avaris, and broke the Hyksos hold on power in Egypt. This was not the removal of every family with roots in Asia. It was the defeat of a ruling dynasty. Ahmose then pursued enemy forces beyond Egypt's borders. Reunification brought a hard lesson. The Nile Valley could not wait behind its walls. Threats had to be met before they arrived. Chapter 15. The New Kingdom Takes Shape. At Thebes, inscriptions of Ahmose's victory did more than celebrate a battle. They presented reunification as the beginning of a larger repair. The Hyksos had shown how dangerous the eastern delta could be when Egypt was divided, so the new king could not simply return to old habits. He had to secure the north, reward soldiers, restore temples, collect revenue, and make the monarchy strong enough to turn recent siege and fracture into lasting order. At Tel el-Dabar, in the eastern delta, archaeologists found the remains of Avaris, the Hyksos capital that had once controlled Egypt's northern doorway. For Ahmose, victory at Thebes was not enough. He had to clear the north, break enemy-held positions, and prevent the delta from becoming a base for rival kings again. The route into Sinai and Western Asia now became a watched frontier, guarded and used by the restored crown. With the northern approaches brought back under royal control, the crown turned south to Nubia. During the years of division, Egypt's hold on these routes, forts, and workers had weakened. Now campaigns pushed authority back along the Nile. This was not only punishment for resistance. Nubia carried gold from the eastern deserts, access to trade, and men who could serve the state. Restoring the south gave the new kings resources for a stronger, more ambitious kingdom. A painted battle scene from this age shows Egyptian soldiers no longer fighting as a temporary levy gathered in crisis. The wars against the Hyksos had taught hard lessons, and the kings kept those lessons alive. Officers gained experience over many campaigns. Archers, infantry, and chariot crews trained for different tasks. Boats moved men and supplies along the Nile, and fleets could support action by sea. Nubian wealth and manpower helped sustain this system, turning victory into a standing royal force. Victory also changed what service could mean for a household. Soldiers and officers did not fight only for rations or obedience. They could receive gold, fine weapons, titles, land, and captives taken in war. A brave commander might return with new rank and a stronger family position. Veterans could settle as respected men with property. In this way, the king turned loyalty in battle into a ladder of status, so expansion served both the throne and the ambitions of those who fought for it. After soldiers and officers received their rewards, conquest wealth also moved into larger hands. The restored monarchy gave land, labor, booty, and offerings to the great temples, especially the cult of Amun at Thebes. In return, temple ritual presented the king as the god's chosen agent, restoring order through victory. This partnership made expansion look sacred and practical at once. Nubian resources helped support it, while the crown and priesthood stored wealth for future campaigns. A boundary stela of Thutmose I, set far to the south, shows how quickly victory changed Egyptian ambition. Ahmose had restored unity, wealth, and command. Amenhotep I inherited that strength, guarded the frontiers, and kept temple and crown working together. Then Thutmose pushed harder, drawing on Nubian gold, soldiers, and supplies. Campaigns beyond the old limits tested a new idea. Egypt would defend itself by controlling the roads before enemies reached the Nile. By the early 18th dynasty, Egypt was no longer just restored. It had been reorganized for power. The king commanded an army that was becoming more permanent and professional. Soldiers and officials could be rewarded with captured goods, land, and status. Nubia supplied gold, labor, and troops. Great temples, especially those linked to Amun, gave conquest religious meaning and received part of its wealth. Together, these forces made expansion a regular habit of government. Chapter 16. Hatshepsut and the Work of Kingship. On a relief from Karnak, Hatshepsut stands within the royal family before she stands alone as king. Her authority began in familiar forms. She was the daughter of Thutmose I, the chief wife of Thutmose II, and the guardian of the young Thutmose III. As regent, she could act to protect the dynasty, manage court business, and preserve succession. The larger question was how that accepted guardianship could become a lasting claim to pharaonic rule. Inscriptions from Hatshepsut's reign show the change happening step by step. She did not simply replace Thutmose III. His name remained inside the royal order, while hers gained the full titles of a king. She took throne names, appeared with the false beard, crown, and kilt of pharaoh, and stood before the gods as ruler. What began as guardianship for a young heir became a shared royal structure, with Hatshepsut claiming kingship in forms every Egyptian viewer could recognize. At Deir el-Bahri, Hatshepsut's reliefs show a careful solution to a political problem. Some inscriptions use feminine forms for her, while many images give her the kilt, crown, false beard, and strong ceremonial body of a king. This was not simple disguise. Egyptian art had a language for power, and the ruler's body was part of that language. By taking the recognized signs of Pharaoh, Hatshepsut made her authority readable to everyone who entered the temple. On the walls of Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahri, reliefs told a carefully shaped sacred story. They showed Amun choosing her before birth, visiting her mother, and marking Hatshepsut as his intended ruler. This did more than honor the god. It made her kingship seem inevitable, not accidental. Priests, temple officials, and court administrators helped carry that claim into ritual life, where divine approval could become daily political authority. In the tomb of Senenmut, Hatshepsut's powerful steward, painted ceilings and careful inscriptions show more than personal ambition. They show a court at work. Hatshepsut's rule depended on loyal officials who collected taxes, managed estates, planned buildings, and supervised labor. Architects turned royal orders into monuments. Priests kept temple rituals moving and presented her authority as part of divine order. Together, these people made her kingship practical, visible, and durable. On the walls of Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahri, the voyage to Punt appears as a royal triumph without a battlefield. Egyptian ships carry crews, goods, and officials across the Red Sea. Foreign envoys receive them, and the return cargo includes incense trees, ebony, ivory, gold, and rare animals. The message is practical and political. A pharaoh could command distant routes, organize exchange, enrich the gods, and prove power through diplomacy as well as war. At Deir el-Bahri, Hatshepsut made kingship into stone. Her temple stood beside the cliffs, linking her rule to Amun, royal ancestors, and public ritual. At Karnak, she added monuments at Egypt's most important sacred center, where priests, officials, and visitors could not miss her name. Her obelisks rose as signs of wealth, order, and divine favor. Later rulers damaged some images, but enough survived to prove how powerfully her buildings had claimed the throne. A recut cartouche on Hatshepsut's monuments shows that her reign did not simply fade from memory. After her death, some images and names were removed, especially those presenting her as king. That damage proves the force of the claim. Her authority had rested on more than one step: royal lineage, priestly support, trusted officials, trade wealth, and vast building projects. Even where chisels attacked her memory, the remaining stone still shows how firmly she had made kingship work without conquest. Chapter 17. Thutmose III and the Egyptian Empire. On the walls at Karnak, lists of foreign towns record the new direction of royal power after Thutmose III became sole pharaoh. Authority no longer had to be proved, mainly inside Egypt, through temples, offices, and court ritual. It could now be demonstrated on campaign. The king led armies into Asia, where victory promised tribute, prestige, and control of trade routes. But each success also tied Egypt to soldiers, envoys, supplies, and officials far beyond the Nile Valley. The annals at Karnak describe Thutmose III's march to Megiddo in unusually practical detail. Facing a coalition of Levantine rulers, he chose the narrow, dangerous road through Aruna, risking ambush to reach the plain quickly. The gamble worked. His army won the field battle, but the enemy escaped behind Megiddo's walls. Victory did not end the campaign. The city had to be surrounded, supplied against, and slowly forced to surrender. A damaged campaign list at Karnak shows that Megiddo was not the end of Thutmose III's northern wars. It was the beginning of a pattern. Year after year, Egyptian forces moved back into Syria-Palestine when the season allowed. Cities that resisted were pressured. Rulers who rebelled were punished. Others sent tribute, hostages, and formal submissions. Each expedition reminded local leaders that Egyptian power could return, making empire a repeated practice, not a single victory. A painted chest from Tutankhamun's tomb shows Egyptian chariots racing through battle, but the army was more than a royal charge. Infantry marched with shields, spears, axes, and bows. Elite chariot crews struck fast, while officers kept units in order. Scribes counted men, rations, weapons, and captured goods. Transport crews moved water, grain, tents, and equipment. Victory depended on courage, but also on supply, repair, camp discipline, and rewards for service. A soldier's reward necklace, shown in tomb scenes as the gold of honor, reveals what campaigns required after the charge was over. Armies marched with stored grain, water skins, cattle, and equipment, then built fortified camps and pressed slow sieges against defended towns. Scribes recorded booty, prisoners, livestock, and weapons. Captives became labor. Wealth flowed to palace and temples, and decorated soldiers learned that service to Pharaoh could bring public status and royal generosity. In the Amarna letters, rulers from Canaan wrote to Pharaoh as men under watch. Their words show how conquest became administration. Egypt often left local kings on their thrones, but their power now depended on loyalty. They sent tribute, hosted Egyptian garrisons, and answered to officials who counted goods and judged behavior. Some royal children were taken to Egypt for education, learning Egyptian ways before returning home as useful dependents. Victory had become supervision. In Egyptian records, foreign princes sometimes appear not as enemies, but as boys raised at court. Brought to Egypt, they learned its language, rituals, and expectations, then could return home tied to Pharaoh by memory and advantage. Scribes made that control durable. They listed gold, timber, livestock, captives, soldiers, officials, and promised deliveries. Empire therefore rested on more than victory. Empire therefore rested on more than victory. It used education, prestige, and written accountability to turn conquest into a profitable, demanding system. The empire made Egypt richer and more powerful, but it also made rule more complicated. Gold from Nubia, timber from abroad, livestock, captives, labor, and tribute moved toward royal storehouses and temple estates. These gains strengthened the image of the pharaoh as a victorious ruler favored by the gods. Yet they depended on records, loyal officials, gifts, garrisons, armies, and repeated intervention far from the Nile. Egypt's greatest empire was profitable, prestigious, and permanently demanding. Chapter 18: Work, Family, and Law in the New Kingdom. In New Kingdom towns, the empire can be seen at the scale of a doorway. Mud brick houses opened into small courts, with storage jars for grain, corners for grinding and weaving, mats for sleeping, and lanes where neighbors carried water and fuel. Wealth from conquest did not reach every family evenly. Some households held more linen, tools, bread, and beer. Others lived closer to shortage, debt, and dependence on officials who measured supplies. New Kingdom prosperity depended on many kinds of work. Cultivators farmed estate land and owed grain, taxes, and periods of forced labor. Along the river, fishers, herders, boatmen, and reed cutters supplied food and materials. Workshops turned linen, wood, copper, leather, and stone into useful goods. Temples and great estates employed priests, scribes, guards, and servants. Some people worked for wages or rations. Others, including enslaved people, lived under stronger control, with fewer choices and fewer rewards. A painted banquet scene shows Egypt at the scale of the body: bread in the hand, linen on the skin, perfume cones, jewelry, music, and cups of beer or wine. Most people shared basic foods like bread, beer, vegetables, and fish, but meat, fine linen, scented oils, and leisure objects marked higher rank. Cosmetics and hair care crossed social lines, yet quality mattered. Pleasure was real, but it was unevenly supplied by labor, officers, and access to surplus. A child's wooden writing board, covered with copied lines, shows how status could be taught by hand. Some boys practiced signs, accounts, and formal phrases until writing became a path into offices, storehouses, temples, and courts. Most children learned differently. They watched parents work, carried tools, guarded animals, ground grain, spun thread, mixed clay, or repeated a craft beside an older worker. Discipline mattered in both worlds. Training prepared children for useful labor, but literacy gave a smaller group direct access to the state. A marriage in New Kingdom Egypt was not sealed by a single sacred ceremony. It became visible through a household, goods moved in, relatives recognized the couple, and property began to be shared. Documents could record dowries, loans, houses, servants, and fields. If a marriage ended, settlements named what each person kept. Women could own property, sell it, sue, testify, and negotiate. Widows and daughters could press inheritance claims, though rank and family pressure shaped every outcome. A medical papyrus shows how closely Egyptian care joined observation, remedy, and protection. A healer might describe a wound, decide whether it could be treated, bind it with linen, and add a spell or amulet. In houses, childbirth was dangerous, infants were fragile, and older bodies carried pain from years of work. Poor sanitation brought parasites and infection. At Deir el-Medina, records make these strains visible in one unusual village, where state labor, family need, and household treatment met every day. At Deir el-Medina, the state can be seen at the scale of a street and a household. This village was not typical of Egypt. Its tomb builders were skilled, protected, and unusually well recorded. Before the famous later strike, they received grain, supplies, tools, and services from royal administration. Their notes list absences, deliveries, side work, debts, letters, prayers, chapels, officers, and watchmen, showing how privileged families still depended on state wages to keep daily life moving. At Deir el-Medina, legal life appears in small records: a stolen tool, an unpaid debt, a quarrel over inheritance, a beating inside a household. People brought petitions, accusations, witnesses, oaths, and contracts before local officials. A respected worker, a widow with documents, or a neighbor with witnesses had stronger ground than someone dependent or low in status. Judgment was practical and uneven. Law was where property, labor, family, and state authority met ordinary need. Chapter 19. Amenhotep III and an Age of Wealth. On the walls of Amenhotep III's Theban buildings, carved lists and offering scenes show wealth made solid in stone. He inherited an empire already fed by taxes, tribute, estates, workshops, and scribal offices. The same systems that pressed unevenly on households through grain dues, labor service, and rank now gathered their richest returns around the king. Court abundance and temple resources grew together, turning foreign goods and Egyptian work into sacred, permanent royal display. A small glazed scarab naming Queen Tiye shows how public her position became. She was not hidden inside private family life. In inscriptions and images, Amenhotep III presented her beside him as a visible partner in rule. Her name traveled beyond Egypt, known to foreign courts that wrote to the king. This marriage strengthened domestic legitimacy and diplomatic presence, while reminding Egyptians that queenship could be part of government, ceremony, and royal identity. A painted scene from Amenhotep III's Jubilee celebrations shows the king running a ritual course before the gods. This was not sport. It was a said festival, a public renewal of kingship. Officials, priests, artists, and palace workers helped turn stored wealth into ceremony, buildings, gifts, and images of power. While households still owed labor and taxes unevenly, court and temples displayed abundance. The aging ruler was presented as vigorous, sacred, and greater than ordinary human authority. At Amarna, archaeologists found clay tablets covered in cuneiform signs, the letters of a wider diplomatic world. They preserve messages between Egypt and Mitanni, Babylonia, Assyria, Hatti, and many smaller rulers in the Levant. These texts show power moving through messengers, trained scribes, formal greetings, marriages, gifts, and repeated bargaining. Armies mattered, but empire also depended on words carried across deserts and courts, where friendship, loyalty, and complaint had to be managed again and again. The Amarna letters show diplomacy as a traffic in wealth and status, not simple generosity. Great kings asked Egypt for gold, luxury goods, and sometimes statues because Pharaoh's resources proved his rank. Marriage worked the same way. Foreign princesses could enter the Egyptian court as diplomatic partners, while Egyptian royal daughters were normally kept at home. This advertised hierarchy, but it also created rivalry, delay, and complaint whenever gifts or attention seemed unequal. The Amarna letters also preserve less polished voices from Egypt's smaller allies. Rulers in Canaan and Syria wrote with urgency, accusing rivals, pleading for soldiers, and asking why Egyptian messengers had not returned. Some complained that promised gold was missing or delayed. Others warned that towns might be lost if Pharaoh ignored them. These tablets show that Egypt's wealth created expectations. Power at the center brought loyalty, but at the edges it also produced anxiety, competition, and resentment. At Thebes, Amenhotep III turned imperial income into stone that could be seen for generations. At Karnak and Luxor, new courts, columns, statues, and sacred spaces expanded the power of Amun's temples. Across the river, his mortuary complex rose on the western plain, guarded by the two giant seated statues later called the Colossi of Memnon. These monuments required quarries, transport crews, craftsmen, temple lands, offerings, records, and taxes. Royal splendor and temple wealth grew together, while ordinary households supplied much of the labor and grain beneath it. Amenhotep III left Egypt rich, but not evenly rich. Gold, land, and offerings flowed toward the palace and the great temples, while farmers, craftsmen, and officials still met taxes, labor duties, and service to the state. Imported luxuries and sacred monuments supported a stronger image of the king as divine, closely linked with the sun and the gods. His successor inherited vast resources, powerful priesthoods, diplomatic expectations, and religious language already turning toward a sharper solar focus. Chapter 20. Akhenaten and the Aten. On early monuments from Karnak, Amenhotep IV still stands inside the familiar world of the new kingdom. The temples are rich, the priests are powerful, and royal worship is already filled with solar language. But the king begins to narrow that tradition around one visible sign, the Aten, the disk of the sun. Publicly, kingship starts to change. Worship centers less on many hidden gods, and more on the king's special access to this radiant power. In royal inscriptions, the change becomes unmistakable. Amenhotep IV no longer presents himself by the old name, which honored Amun. He takes a new one, Akhenaten, meaning useful to the Aten or effective for the Aten. This was not a private devotion. A pharaoh's name was public authority, carved on monuments, spoken in ceremonies, and tied to law. By changing it, the king made his own identity carry the new religious policy. After Akhenaten tied his own name to the Aten, the pressure moved outward. Older gods could be pushed aside, their images ignored, and their names damaged on monuments. Amun was the clearest target, because his temples were not only places of worship. They owned land, managed workers, received offerings, and carried public prestige. To weaken Amun was to weaken a powerful institution, redirecting wealth and authority toward the king's new religious court. In reliefs from Amarna, Aten appears not as a hidden statue in a dark sanctuary, but as the sun disk, sending rays down into open courts. The rays touch Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters, often ending in tiny hands. This changed the path to the divine. Older temples had many gods, priests, and local traditions. Aten worship narrowed that access. The royal family stood at the center, presenting itself as the visible channel to the god. On the cliffs around a new desert bay, Akhenaten carved boundary stelae to mark the place he called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. He did not rebuild Thebes or claim another old sacred city. He chose open ground and defined it by royal decree. The inscriptions presented the site as the Aten's own landscape, with palaces, temples, roads, and officials arranged around court ritual. Geography now served the reform, separating it from older cults and their memories. At Akhetaten, the evidence is not only royal language carved in stone. Archaeology shows a working capital. There were palaces, large official houses, smaller homes, worker areas, workshops, roads, storage buildings, and wide-open courts for the Aten's temples. Food, raw materials, taxes, and finished goods had to move through this place every day. The city displayed the king's new religion, but it also depended on scribes, laborers, craftsmen, servants, and families tied to the court. The change at Amarna was not only built in mud brick and new temples, it was also drawn on walls and carved in stone. Royal bodies became longer and softer. Figures moved with more looseness. The king, queen, and children appeared together in scenes of touch and affection. Above them, the Aten's rays reached down with tiny hands. Art now made the royal household the center of worship, turning religious rupture into a public image. The Amarna letters show Egypt still watching a troubled world beyond the Nile. While Akhenaten poured wealth into the Aten, older temples lost influence, priests lost power, and officials had to serve a new capital built around the king. Abroad, allies and vassals asked for help as pressure grew in Syria and Canaan. But most evidence for the reform comes from royal art and elite display. The new order was bold, yet too dependent on Akhenaten, his court, and Akhetaten to endure. Chapter 21. Tutankhamun and the Restoration. On a small faience ring, the young king's name appears in transition, Tutankhaten, soon to become Tutankhamun. That change says much about the moment. After Akhenaten's Amarna experiment, Egypt's temples, offices, and royal authority needed repair. But the heir was still a child. Real government depended on older courtiers, priests, administrators, and military men around him. Restoration began in his name, yet its direction was shaped by powerful adults who could turn royal weakness into their own authority. On objects from the restored court, the change appears in the king's own name. He had come to the throne as Tutankhaten, a child tied by title to the Aten. Soon he became Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. His queen's name changed too, from Ankhesenpa Aten to Ankhesenamun. These were public signals. The royal household was no longer presenting itself through Akhenaten's god, but through the older religious language that could make its rule acceptable again. After the royal names changed, the court also moved. Akhenaten was no longer treated as Egypt's permanent center of power. Government turned back toward older places, especially Memphis in the north and Thebes in the south. That mattered because those cities held the working machinery of the kingdom: priests, scribes, officials, workshops, army connections, and temple estates. Leaving Akhenaten weakened the Aten project in practice, not just in symbol, and made restoration possible through older institutions. The Restoration Decree gives the official reason for leaving Amarna behind. It says Egypt had suffered because the old temples were neglected. Divine images were missing or damaged. Offerings had stopped, festivals had failed, and the gods no longer supported the land as they should. Tutankhamun's court answered by rebuilding sanctuaries, restoring cult statues, appointing priests, and renewing daily offerings. At Thebes, Amun's priesthood regained estates, income, processions, and public authority. Tutankhamun's restoration did more than reopen temples. It returned power to the institutions that served the old gods, especially Amun at Thebes. Royal gifts again supported temple estates, priests, workshops, offerings, and public festivals. This made worship visible in daily life and tied the young king to a respected tradition. But it also restored a strong priesthood with land, wealth, and influence, making religion once again a major force inside the Egyptian state. When Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, the public story of restored temples gave way to private evidence of a royal life. Inside were nested shrines and coffins, gold jewelry, chariots, beds, chairs, clothing, food, weapons, walking sticks, games, and ritual tools. These were not random treasures. They were possessions turned into provisions, meant to protect, feed, carry, and honor the young king in eternity. Yet all that abundance could not solve the political weakness left by his early death. Tutankhamun's burial was rich, but it could not hide the weakness of the throne. He died while still young, and no surviving child stood ready to inherit. His widow, Ankhesenamun, was left exposed inside a court full of older officials and soldiers. Later Hittite records describe an Egyptian queen asking for a foreign prince as husband. If this was Ankhesenamun, it shows how desperate the succession had become. The restored order had no secure royal line. After Tutankhamun died without a secure heir, the restoration he had begun could not settle the dynasty. An old court official tied to the royal household, took the throne and kept the return to traditional worship in place. But the deeper weakness remained. Legitimacy no longer rested safely on bloodline alone. Horemheb, the army commander, eventually replaced the last Amarna-linked rulers and claimed authority as the man who restored order. In official memory, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and I could be shortened, skipped, or folded away. Chapter 22. Ramses II, War, Peace, and Monuments. A relief of young Ramses beside Seti I shows the message clearly. This was not a prince appearing from nowhere. He had grown up inside a restored military monarchy, linked to campaigns, court ceremony, and public succession. Seti had rebuilt royal authority after earlier disorder, and Ramses inherited that strength. But inheritance was only the starting point. His first image as king presented continuity, discipline, and readiness to act on Egypt's power. A carved battle relief from early in Ramses II's reign shows the young king larger than his soldiers, driving forward as commander, not simply as heir. That image mattered. He had inherited a military monarchy from Seti I, but inheritance was only the beginning. Egypt's northern borders needed attention, and the army expected action. By appearing in the field and directing troops, Ramses turned succession into proof. His kingship had to be seen defending Egypt. At Kadesh, Ramesses marched north expecting a clear victory over the Hittites. But the information reaching him was wrong. His army was stretched out in separate divisions, and the enemy was closer than he believed. Hittite chariots struck suddenly, breaking into the Egyptian camp and throwing the march into confusion. In the crisis, the young king had the setting for heroic action, but the battle also showed how fragile command could become when distance, speed, and bad intelligence worked against Egypt. On temple walls, the Battle of Kadesh became something clearer than the battlefield had been. The inscriptions showed Ramses II surrounded yet fearless, calling on Amun and driving back his enemies almost alone. This was not a careful military report. It was managed memory. The uncertain result was reshaped into royal victory, where courage, divine favor, and restored order mattered more than the limits of conquest. A clay tablet preserves the peace made between Egypt and Hatti after years of rivalry. It did not pretend that one side had destroyed the other. Instead, it set rules for a stable border, promised non-aggression, and offered help if enemies or rebels threatened either king. For Ramesses II, this was another form of power. The battle story could fill temple walls, but the treaty showed that kingship also depended on knowing when to bargain and hold order. After the treaty, peace took a visible form at court. A Hittite princess came to Egypt to become a royal wife of Ramses II. Her arrival turned diplomacy into a public family event. Egyptian audiences could see that a former enemy now sent a daughter into Pharaoh's household. For Ramesses, this was more than marriage. It displayed recognition from abroad, splendor at home, and the idea that his dynasty stood at the center of the known world. In the eastern delta, Ramesses built his power into a city. Pi-Ramesses stood close to the roads leading toward Asia, where armies, envoys, traders, and messengers moved in and out of Egypt. It was not only a palace town, it held workshops, storehouses, stables, barracks, and offices that kept royal policy supplied. From this northern base, kingship could be displayed to visitors, but also organized in practical ways, with horses, grain, craftsmen, scribes, and roads. The Ramesseum at Thebes shows how Ramesses II turned power into stone. His wars did not give Egypt unlimited conquest, but his builders gave his reign a lasting presence. Quarries, transport crews, scribes, and labor gangs moved huge blocks and raised temples, statues, and carved walls from Egypt into Nubia. At Abu Simbel and in temple additions across the land, his name appeared again and again. Managed memory outlasted uncertain battles, making kingship seem permanent. Chapter 23: The Ramesside State Under Pressure. A small ostracon naming late New Kingdom officials hints at a court where authority depended on careful recognition. After the long reigns that had made kingship look steady, Egypt entered a more uncertain passage. Claims to the throne competed, reigns shortened, and royal succession no longer seemed automatic. The new ruling house tried to wear the old language of command, but the center had already shown weakness. Before foreign pressure arrived, palace politics had begun to crack the image of permanent control. On the walls of Medinet Habu, Ramesses III appears as the old warrior king, striking enemies before the gods and recording victory in formal royal language. But these wars were not campaigns of confident expansion. They were defensive struggles against Libyans, sea peoples, and moving groups pressing Egypt's borders. The inscriptions made survival look like conquest. In reality, the new regime was trying to restore the image of command while fighting to preserve what earlier pharaohs had claimed to control. A carved battle scene from Medinet Habu shows Ramesses III defeating foreign attackers. The claim was victory, and in military terms, Egypt did survive. But survival was not the same as recovery. Across the eastern Mediterranean, trade routes broke, client states weakened, and old diplomatic ties became less dependable. Egypt could still defend its borders, yet the empire beyond them no longer supplied the same revenue, prestige goods, or protective buffer zones. A carved battle scene of Ramesses III shows Libyan warriors as defeated outsiders, but that was only part of the story. Over time, Western groups did not simply vanish after campaigns. Some settled in Egypt, some served as soldiers, some became tied to local officials and military households. Frontier pressure had moved inside the state. At the same time, danger also came from the palace itself, as the harem conspiracy showed. Royal authority was being strained from both directions. A surviving court record, often called the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, describes a plot against Ramses III from inside the palace. Members of the royal household, including women of the harem and officials close to power, were accused of trying to place another prince on the throne. The trials displayed punishment and control, but they also revealed something deeper. Egypt faced pressure from frontiers and migrants, yet danger also came from rivalry within the royal family itself. The tomb robbery papyri from Thebes record a different kind of crisis. Royal burials, meant to protect a king's body and memory forever, were being broken open. The investigations named thieves, guards, scribes, and officials, showing that the crimes depended on local networks, not only desperate robbers. When administrators could be bribed and sacred property could vanish, royal authority was failing far beyond the palace. The state was losing control of its own past. At Deir el-Medina, the village of workers who cut and decorated royal tombs, scribes recorded a serious failure. Grain rations arrived late or did not arrive at all. These men served the king's afterlife, yet their families could not be fed. They stopped work and protested. The strike showed more than local anger. It revealed a broken revenue chain where corruption, war costs, and weakened authority left the state unable to pay even its most symbolic laborers. The end of the new kingdom was not a sudden collapse. Egypt still had temples, scribes, armies, and officials, but power no longer gathered securely around the pharaoh. Weak succession, costly defense, lost trade, frontier pressure, palace conflict, corruption, and unpaid workers all pointed to the same strain. If tomb builders could not receive rations, the royal system was failing to move revenue. Temples and regional leaders kept resources, and Egypt's unity divided. Chapter 24: Libyan Kings and Divided Rule. A tax record from this period shows Egypt did not simply fall silent after the new kingdom. Officials still counted grain, temples still received offerings, and royal names still carried authority. But power no longer moved from one imperial center. In the Delta, rulers claimed kingship. In Upper Egypt, priestly leaders controlled major cults and estates. Across the provinces, local families held inherited offices. Egypt kept working, but its authority was now negotiated among overlapping centers of rule. At Tanis in the eastern delta, royal tombs and temple blocks show that northern kings did not simply pretend to rule. They used full pharaonic titles, honored the gods, built monuments, and planned burials in royal style. Control of delta routes gave them wealth and leverage, but their reach weakened farther south. Power had to be bargained with priests, local officials, and rival centers, especially Thebes, where temple authority carried its own real command. In Upper Egypt, power gathered around the great temple of Amun at Thebes. Its high priests controlled land, workshops, storehouses, and large numbers of workers. They directed rituals, managed estates, and supervised local administration. Documents could be dated by their years in office, a sign of authority close to kingship. Yet they did not present themselves as rebels. They used the language of pharaonic order, while Tanite kings held royal legitimacy in the north. A useful object here is a Libyan chief's burial equipment, made in Egyptian style, but carrying names and titles from families of Western origin. It shows that these groups were not simply outsiders replacing Egypt. Many had entered through military service, received land, married locally, and held command posts. Their descendants served as officials and local rulers. Over time, kinship networks linked army households, towns, and royal courts, helping Libyan-descended chiefs turn embedded authority into dynastic power. At Bubastis in the eastern delta, blocks from temples built by Shoshonk's line show a new center of royal attention. The 22nd dynasty was not a sudden foreign occupation. It grew from Libyan-descended families already settled in Egypt, often serving as soldiers and local chiefs. Once in power, These kings placed sons and relatives in priesthoods, army commands, and provincial offices. Kinship helped coordinate the country, but it also made strong regional households harder to control. A bronze statuette dedicated by a god's wife of Amun shows how sacred office could become political power. At Thebes, this was separate from the high priesthood, but just as important. Royal women and elite appointees performed rituals for Amun, controlled estates, supervised servants and scribes, and managed temple wealth. Dynasties seeking influence in the south used the office carefully, because a god's wife could connect royal ambition to Theban religious authority. A boundary stealer from a provincial estate shows how power worked when Egypt was divided. Local governors could honor a king, serve a temple, command troops, and still protect their own family interests. Alliances shifted from town to town. Some rulers were recognized in one region but ignored in another. This made government workable because taxes, worship, burials, and records continued. Yet unity was fragile. Egypt remained organized, but its loyalties no longer formed one strong chain of command. A reused royal statue, carved for one king and later claimed by another, shows how Egypt's old language of power kept working. Even with authority divided, temples collected income, priests maintained rituals, scribes copied records, and families prepared tombs with familiar hopes for the afterlife. Artists restored older forms and rulers borrowed ancient images to prove legitimacy. Culture held together, but strategy did not. Without lasting unity, Egypt faced growing pressure from Nubia and Western Asia. Chapter 25: Kushite Pharaohs and Assyrian Armies. At Jebel Barkal, beside the Nile in Nubia, a steep sandstone mountain rose over Napata. Egyptians had long treated this place as sacred to Amun, the god also worshipped at Thebes. Kushite kings used that connection carefully. From Napata, they presented their rule as old and legitimate, not as a raid from the south. By honoring Amun, copying pharaonic forms, and tying themselves to Egypt's sacred past, they claimed they were restoring order. On Pierre's victory stele, carved after his northern campaign, the Kushite king does not present himself as a foreign raider. He marches from Napata into a divided Egypt, where Libyan-descended chiefs, city rulers, and rival kings hold separate powers. The text says he purifies himself, honors Amun, and demands submission from those who resisted. His victory turns battle into ritual proof that Amun has chosen him to restore proper kingship. After Pierre, victory had to become government. His successors formed Egypt's 25th dynasty, Shabaka, Shabitku, Tahaka, and later Tantamani. They ruled from Egyptian centers and worked through familiar offices, priesthoods, scribes, and local elites. Taxes, temple service, and court titles continued in recognizable forms. Yet this was also a Kushite royal house, tied to Nubian traditions and southern sacred places. Egypt and Nubia were briefly joined under one family, using Egyptian institutions to hold a wider kingdom together. A temple relief from this period shows a Kushite pharaoh before Amun, offering to the god in the old Egyptian manner. This was the message of their rule. They did not present themselves only as conquerors from the south. They repaired temples, renewed priestly cults, and copied older royal forms. By using ancient titles, pious building programs, and images of order restored, they claimed to guard Ma'at, the sacred balance that made unified kingship legitimate. In Nubia, the Kushite kings expressed power in their own royal ground. At El Kuru, and later at Nuri, they built pyramid cemeteries for kings and royal women. The form used Egyptian mortuary symbols, but the landscape was Kushite. These burials tied the dynasty to southern ancestors, local sacred places, and older traditions of rule. So while Kushite rulers governed Egypt through pharaonic offices, their royal memory remained anchored far to the south. A small scarab from the delta, stamped with a Kushite royal name, shows how far southern kingship had reached. But Egypt's restored power now looked beyond the Nile. In the Levant, cities and kingdoms tried to loosen Assyria's grip, and Kushite Egypt gave them support, encouragement, or the hope of support. This brought prestige, but also danger. Sacred kingship could reunite Egypt, yet Assyria tested whether it could survive imperial war. A stone relief from Assyria shows soldiers crossing rivers, attacking cities, and carrying away prisoners. It reflects the kind of army Egypt now faced. Esarhaddon invaded with forces built for long imperial campaigns, and Memphis fell to him. Kushite rule in Egypt was broken apart. Later, Ashurbanipal returned to enforce Assyrian control. Local Egyptian rulers were installed or supported, not to restore unity, but to keep the country divided, dependent, and easier to command. A record from Assyrian king Ashurbanipal describes the blow that ended Kushite hopes in Egypt. After Memphis fell, Tantamani tried to fight back and recover the country under restored pharaonic rule. But Assyrian retaliation drove south and reached Thebes, the great sacred city of Amun. Its sack was a deep symbolic rupture. Egypt could still be reunited by kingship, but sacred legitimacy could not stop imperial armies. Kushite power withdrew toward Nubia, and Egypt's survival now depended on the balance of larger empires. Chapter 26: The Sayyid Revival and the First Persian Conquest. A statue from Sais would have reminded viewers that power in Egypt could begin far from Memphis or Thebes. Psamtik I ruled from this western delta city, where local authority survived after stronger overlords weakened. His task was practical before it was symbolic. He had to win support, manage rival delta chiefs, and make officials treat his State House as the government of Egypt, not just another regional court. A statue from Saït, Egypt, shows Psamtik I kneeling before a god, presenting himself as a proper Egyptian king. Behind that image was hard political work. He reduced rival local rulers, absorbed regional power centers, and made cooperation with powerful temples part of royal government again. Victory mattered, but negotiation mattered too. Egypt could be reunited only if local elites, priests, scribes, and officials agreed to make the king's orders work along the Nile. A Greek helmet found in Egypt points to a new source of Saït power. Psamtik and his successors hired Greek and Carian soldiers, men from across the eastern Mediterranean who fought for pay. These troops gave the king a force less tied to old provincial loyalties. They helped defend royal authority and support reunification. But this strength came with dependence. Egypt's security now reached into the same sea lanes, ports, wages, and foreign communities that connected Saït rule to a wider world. At Naucratis in the western delta, Greek pottery and inscriptions show a trading town working under Egyptian permission. The Saït kings did not simply open the country without control. They channeled Mediterranean exchange through known ports, taxed goods, and watched foreign communities through Egyptian officials. Phoenician ships linked Egypt to wider sea routes, while Greeks brought trade, skills, and soldiers. The same networks that supplied mercenaries also filled royal treasuries, making foreign activity useful and visible to Egyptian authority. A Saït statue in an older style could look, at first, like a work from Egypt's distant past. That was the point. The kings of Sais used ancient forms in art, inscriptions, temple ritual, and court ceremony to make their restored rule feel deeply Egyptian. This was not simple nostalgia. It was a political language. After reunification, archaism helped present a recent dynasty as the rightful continuation of a very old royal order. At Saqqara and other sacred places, thousands of animal mummies show how deeply temples shaped Saït life. Cats, ibises, falcons, and bulls were prepared by skilled workers, bought by worshippers, and offered to the gods. Temples were not only places of prayer. They owned land, managed income, hired craftsmen, and supported scribes and embalmers. In this setting, the Saït revival became more than royal style. It lived in local devotion, workshop skill, burial practice, and community identity. At Saqqara and Memphis, foreign names appear beside Egyptian offices, temples, and burial customs. Greeks, Carians, Phoenicians, and others served as soldiers, sailors, traders, and skilled workers. They brought weapons, goods, languages, and contacts that helped the Saite kings rebuild power. Yet they did not rule Egypt. Law, taxes, ritual, and rank still passed through Egyptian institutions. Before conquest, foreigners could be useful and visible, but sovereignty remained framed by the pharaoh. In 525 BCE, Cambyses II brought the Persian army into Egypt. The last Saite resistance was defeated, and the country was no longer an independent kingdom. It became part of the Persian imperial world. The Saite recovery had been real. Diplomacy, Greek mercenaries, Mediterranean trade, and revived Egyptian traditions had strengthened the state. But those same connections placed Egypt in the path of expanding empires. Foreigners had once served Egyptian kings. Now Egypt served a foreign empire. Chapter 27. Persian Rule, Revolt, and Alexander. A Persian royal image carved in Egyptian style shows how power now worked. The king could appear as pharaoh, offering to the gods and using familiar titles, but he ruled from an empire beyond the Nile. In Egypt, appointed satraps carried out imperial orders. Older offices, tax systems, scribal habits, and temple ties continued because they helped govern the country. Yet this was not restored self-rule. Egyptian institutions survived, while supreme command passed to foreign hands. At Elephantine, near Egypt's southern border, papyrus letters from a military colony show how Persian rule worked on the ground. Egypt was valuable because it produced grain, labor, taxes, and river access. Persian officials counted harvests, demanded supplies, guarded routes, and placed soldiers at key points. These controls kept the empire fed and secure, but they also made foreign power part of daily life. When imperial authority weakened, Egyptian resistance could turn taxes and garrisons into arguments for renewed native rule. A temple inscription from Persian Egypt could still name the king in familiar sacred language. It showed him honoring gods, protecting offerings, and confirming the place of priests. These acts mattered. Temples held land, stored grain, employed workers, and spoke for local communities. But patronage did not mean independence. Behind the rituals stood foreign command, satraps, soldiers, and imperial demands. Egyptian institutions survived and remained influential, yet they now worked inside a system ruled from outside Egypt. A stela from this age could show an Egyptian king in familiar pharaonic pose, yet the power behind that image was fragile. Persian rule had taken taxes, troops, and grain under imperial supervision. When Persia weakened, Egyptian leaders turned resistance into government. The 28th dynasty broke away first. The 29th followed, more organized but still insecure. These rulers claimed native kingship, while relying on soldiers, diplomacy, and Persia's wider troubles to keep independence alive. A temple block from Nectanebo II's reign shows the old language of kingship still alive. He presented himself as a true Egyptian pharaoh, building for the gods and defending the land. The earlier 28th and 29th dynasties had kept native resistance alive, but the 30th dynasty was its final full expression. Nectanebo sought alliances and prepared against Persia, yet imperial pressure kept growing. His reign became the culmination of native rule, not a lasting restoration. In 3043 BCE, Persian armies returned in force. Nectanebo II, the last native pharaoh, had built temples, sought allies, and defended the old kingship, but it was not enough. Egypt was taken back into the Persian Empire, and native rule ended. Persian officials again controlled taxes, garrisons, and appointments. Many Egyptian elites obeyed, but resentment remained. When Persian authority weakened, they had reason to consider any new conqueror who promised order. A carved temple relief could present Alexander in the old Egyptian manner, offering to the gods as a pharaoh should. Yet the man behind that image was not a native king. In 332 BCE, after Persian power weakened across the eastern Mediterranean, Alexander entered Egypt and was accepted by Egyptian officials and priests. Persian rule ended there, but Egyptian independence did not return. Supreme authority had passed to a Macedonian conqueror using pharaonic forms. After being accepted as pharaoh, Alexander traveled west across the desert to the Oracle of Amun at Siwa. The visit linked his rule to Egypt's old divine kingship, but it also marked a change. He was not restoring native power. On the Mediterranean coast, he founded Alexandria, a new city facing Greek trade routes and imperial movement. Temples, priests, scribes, and taxes continued, but supreme authority had passed from Persia to Macedon. Chapter 28. The Ptolemaic Kingdom. A stone relief of Ptolemy I shows a Macedonian ruler acting like an Egyptian pharaoh. That was the bargain at the start of his dynasty. After Alexander died, Ptolemy held Egypt as governor, then strengthened his claim by keeping Alexander's body in Egypt as a powerful symbol. When rival successors threatened the Nile Valley, he fought them off. In 305 BC, he took the title of king, while using Egyptian forms of rule to make that power acceptable. Alexandria showed what Ptolemaic Egypt wanted the wider world to see. Its great harbour opened toward the eastern Mediterranean. Ships brought merchants, officials, soldiers, scholars, and grain buyers into a Greek-planned capital, with warehouses, palaces, and the famous lighthouse marking royal power. This was not a Nile village grown old beside fields and canals. It was a maritime city, built to gather Egypt's wealth and displayed in a language foreign rulers understood. A catalogue tablet from Alexandria points to a court that treated knowledge as royal property. In the Malsion and library, Ptolemaic kings paid scholars to collect books, compare texts, translate languages, study medicine, calculate mathematics, and write poetry. This was prestige, but it was also administration. The same dynasty that classified poems and histories classified fields, crops, taxes, and workers, using records to make Egypt's wealth visible, countable, and easier to command. A land grant written on papyrus shows how power moved beyond Alexandria into the countryside. Greek and Macedonian soldiers, called cleruks, received plots of Egyptian land in return for military service. They farmed through tenants, collected income, and remained tied to the army and the royal court. In towns and villages, they lived beside Egyptian families, traded with them, sometimes married them, and joined shared cults. But privilege was unequal. Greek language, courts, and administration often gave settlers the stronger position. A tax register from Ptolemaic Egypt shows the system behind Alexandria's wealth. Fields were measured, crops estimated, and harvests written down before they reached the market. Grain, oil, papyrus, and other goods passed through royal controls or monopolies. Farmers owed rent, labor, and taxes in money or produce. Greek and Egyptian scribes, accountants, and village officials carried orders into the countryside. The same habit of collecting knowledge that filled libraries also counted land, people, and revenue. On temple walls from this period, Ptolemaic kings appear like older pharaohs, offering gifts to Egyptian gods. This was not decoration alone. A Macedonian ruler could not govern Egypt through Greek soldiers and officials without help from Egyptian religious authority. The kings funded temples, protected priestly privileges, and supported festivals and cult rituals. In return, priests helped present foreign rule as part of sacred order, translating power into legitimacy that Egyptian subjects could recognize. A dedication to Serapis shows the Ptolemies trying to join two religious worlds. The god could speak to Greek settlers while still fitting Egyptian ideas of divine power. Ruler cults did similar work, presenting the king and queen as sacred figures worthy of loyalty. But shared worship did not make society equal. Greek language, Greek courts, government offices, and tax privileges still carried advantage, even as families intermarried and local customs blended. Petitions preserved on papyrus show the pressure clearly. Farmers complained about unfair officials, missing payments, and demands they could not meet. Some people resisted taxes by hiding grain, leaving villages, or joining local revolts. The Ptolemaic kingdom remained rich, and its rulers still used Egyptian religious legitimacy, but the compromise was strained. Unequal treatment divided society, and later dynastic disputes increasingly needed Roman support. Egypt was powerful, diverse, and wealthy, but its independence had become vulnerable. Chapter 29. Cleopatra and the Roman Balance. A Greek inscription from Ptolemaic Egypt points to the world Cleopatra was born into, a Macedonian dynasty ruling an older Egyptian kingdom. She was educated in Greek politics, court ceremony, and royal competition. But Cleopatra stood apart because she could speak Egyptian, and other languages as well. That mattered. In Alexandria, she could deal with Greek officials and diplomats. In the temples, she could present herself to priests and subjects through Egypt's sacred traditions, with fewer voices standing between ruler and people. On temple walls and in royal titles, Cleopatra could appear not only as a Greek queen, but as an Egyptian ruler favored by the gods. Her link with Isis mattered because Isis stood for kingship, protection, and renewal. At the same time, dynasty custom placed her beside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, as co-ruler. This made her rule legitimate, but fragile. She had to satisfy priests, Egyptian subjects, and Greek elites, while sharing a throne that could easily become a battlefield. A Roman report on Pompey's death shows how quickly Egypt's palace quarrel became part of Rome's war. Cleopatra had lost secure control to Ptolemy XIII's advisors and was forced away from Alexandria. Her claim still rested on dynasty, language, and royal legitimacy. But the court now looked to Roman recognition. When Julius Caesar arrived in the city after Pompey was killed, the dispute was no longer only Egyptian. Rome had become the judge, and that made Caesar both a danger and an opportunity. Caesar chose to back Cleopatra, and that decision changed the struggle in Alexandria. What had been a palace contest became a war fought around the royal quarter, the harbor, and divided city factions. Ptolemy XIII's forces resisted, but Roman troops gave Cleopatra the decisive advantage. When Ptolemy was defeated and died, Cleopatra returned to the throne. Yet her restoration did not come from Egyptian agreement alone. It rested openly on Roman protection. After the war in Alexandria, Cleopatra returned to rule, but she did not rule alone. Her younger brother Ptolemy XIV became her formal co-ruler, keeping the old dynastic pattern in place. At the same time, Cleopatra presented her infant son, Caesarion, as the future of the house. The message was practical and political. Egypt had survived civil conflict, and its monarchy now claimed a new stability, strengthened by a visible link to Julius Caesar and Roman prestige. A silver coin from Cleopatra's reign shows how power moved through ordinary hands. Her government was not only palace meetings and Roman friendships. It collected taxes, managed estates, and drew wealth from Egypt's fields and ports. Grain from the Nile could feed cities across the Mediterranean, including Rome. Temples received royal attention, linking her rule to Egyptian tradition. Coins carried her image into markets, pay chests, and shops, turning daily exchange into a message of monarchy. After Caesar's death, Cleopatra again looked to Rome for survival. The strongest figure in the East was Mark Antony, and she made Egypt essential to his power. Their alliance became personal and political. They had children, and Antony recognized wider claims for Cleopatra and her dynasty. In return, Egypt offered what he needed against Octavian: money, ships, grain, and the prestige of an ancient monarchy. Cleopatra's independence now rested on Antony's success. At Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony staged a public ceremony later known as the Donations of Alexandria. Cleopatra appeared as queen, Caesarion was honored as Caesar's son, and her children received Eastern titles and territories. To Cleopatra, this display showed a restored, wealthy kingdom with heirs and Roman military support. To Octavian, it was perfect ammunition. He told Romans that Antony had surrendered to a foreign queen. Egypt's independence now depended on Antony winning Rome's civil war. Chapter 30. Roman Conquest and Egypt's Long Continuity. A Roman relief of warships helps mark the turning point. In 31 BCE, off Actium in western Greece, Octavian's fleet defeated the naval coalition of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. The battle did not end in Egypt, but it made Egypt dangerously exposed. Antony and Cleopatra escaped to Alexandria, yet their alliance had lost its strength. Octavian could now present himself as Rome's defender. while Egypt became the refuge of a defeated political partnership, no longer able to protect its independence alone. In 30 BCE, Octavian entered Egypt as the victor of Rome's civil war. Alexandria, once the proud capital of the Ptolemies, surrendered. Antony died after his final defeat, and Cleopatra soon followed, ending her attempt to preserve an independent throne. Octavian did not place another client ruler in power. He annexed Egypt directly, ending the Ptolemaic dynasty and making the country a possession of Rome, controlled for the emperor's own purposes. A papyrus tax register from Roman Egypt shows how conquest became daily rule. After annexation, Egypt was not treated like an ordinary province. Augustus kept it under his personal control. Senators could not enter without permission because its grain, wealth, and armies were too important. An equestrian prefect governed in the emperor's name, while legions held Alexandria, the Nile Valley, and the southern frontier. Roman power now worked through soldiers, records, taxes, and administration. A census returned from Roman Egypt could list a household by name, age, status, and property. It shows how conquest became paperwork. Officials registered people, measured fields, assigned tax categories, and checked accounts. A farmer owed land tax on his fields, rent if he worked state or temple land, and poll tax for adult males. Harvests moved from village records to Nile boats, then toward the Mediterranean, because Rome depended on Egypt's grain. A grain receipt from Roman Egypt shows how tightly the harvest was measured. Farmers owed taxes in wheat, collected from fields and households after the Nile flood made the land productive. Sacks of grain moved to state granaries, then onto riverboats sailing north toward Alexandria. From there, larger ships crossed the Mediterranean to feed Rome. For the empire, Egypt was not just a conquered kingdom. It was a dependable breadbasket, organized village by village. A village petition written in Greek shows how Roman Egypt worked beyond the grain ships. Most people still lived by the Nile's fields, clearing canals, lifting water, planting, harvesting, and paying rent or taxes from the crop. Some farmed as tenants and fell into debt. Families worked together, while local elites translated rules, collected payments, and carried complaints upward. Roman power was distant, but its demands reached every village through paperwork, inequality, and labor. Roman rule brought heavier oversight, new taxes, and governors who answered to an emperor far away. Yet Egyptian life did not simply disappear. Temples still owned land, priests still kept rituals, and local festivals still gathered towns around familiar gods. Families continued mummification, though portraits, names, and burial styles often mixed Egyptian, Greek, and Roman habits. In courts and contracts, people moved between legal traditions. Egypt had lost its dynasty, but its institutions and identities kept adapting. Egypt did not vanish when Rome took control. Its legacy moved through new hands. Egyptian scripts, copied on temple walls and studied by later scholars, preserved names, prayers, and records. Monuments kept teaching rulers how power could look permanent. Religious images, artistic forms, medical remedies, mathematical habits, tax systems, and careful bureaucracy passed into Greek and Roman worlds. Over time, later cultures remembered Egypt not as a single fallen kingdom, but as a civilization transformed and carried forward.